All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to start off today's class with a debate, and I'll get about as close as I get to a trigger warning and tell you that it's going to be a debate about a pretty heavy subject. So I'm going to give you a scenario up on the board, and your turning point question for today is going to ask you, what would you do in this kind of a scenario? So let me read to you what's going on here. There we go. Two of your friends, Jordan and Leah, have been flirting for the last month. Jordan asks Leah out, but she turns him down. She says to him, I really like you, but I'm just not in a place to date anyone right now. I'm going through some personal stuff. I hope you understand. So take a second and sit with that. You're going to get some more information here. Another friend, we're going to call this friend Michael, recently told you a rumor that he heard from multiple sources that Leah has an STD. She recently found out that she had. Michael is good friends with Leah, and he's never lied to you, but he's never directly asked Leah about the rumor because he's afraid it'll hurt their friendship. Jordan calls you. He's pretty upset. He's crying. He calls you to ask for advice. He said he's confused and he's hurt, but ultimately he still likes Leah and still thinks he has a chance with her. He still wants to date her. You know that Jordan has not heard the rumor. So my question for you for the day is, what do you tell Jordan the rumor? I want you to think about that for a second. I'll put the turning point stuff up for you. Does anybody have any questions before we get into that? Questions about the scenario? I might not be able to answer them. Pretty heavy stuff, I know. So take a second to think about it. If you're using a hard clicker, I'm going to have you type in go or channel 41 and then go or channel again. If you're using the phone app, I put the wrong code up here. It's actually 110B, so I apologize for that. You guys are section B, so your section code is 110B. So I'm going to ask you again if you would tell Jordan the rumor, if you think you should tell Jordan the rumor. Now, I'll put up the slide in a second here, but I want you to know that it's going to ask you if you strongly agree that you should tell him, you agree, you disagree, or you strongly disagree. There's no staying neutral in here. You have to make a decision. You're on the phone with him. You don't get to back out. You have to decide if you should or shouldn't tell him the rumor. So go ahead. If you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree about whether you should tell Jordan the rumor about Leah. Again, our code, GO41GO, or 110B. If you've already clicked in, go ahead, and if you're comfortable, start talking to your neighbor about what you decided. If you're still clicking in, go ahead and click in, and if you don't talk to your neighbors, that's okay too. We'll talk as a class in a minute here. Raise your hand if you still need a little more time to click in. 2 or 3 of you? Okay. Take about 30 seconds or so. We're also going to try something new in here. If you think your clicker is working but you're not sure it's working, or if you know your clicker is not working, I'm trying to be really understanding that clickers have been kind of a mess in here. So if you want to do a hard copy, you have that option. If you still have a clicker that you know works and you're clicking in, it's going to help us see our data. But if you want to get credit and you're not sure you're going to be able to get your clicker set up, go ahead and write down your name and what answer you would choose here. Has everybody clicked in or had a chance to do so? All right, let's see if it'll show us our results today. There we go. So you guys are less split than my last class. with the vast majority of you saying, yeah, I think we should tell Jordan the rumor. Probably about half of you agree, another 17% of you strongly agree you should tell him the rumor. So if you're comfortable sharing, somebody who's comfortable sharing why you would tell Jordan over the phone with him the rumor of whether Leah has an STD. Go ahead and share with us why you think it's a good idea, why you agree or strongly agree that you should do so. I know it's not an easy subject, but I'm hoping there will be some brave volunteers. You'll have other people to back you up. There's nobody who's alone here. Go ahead.
I put just like agree, because when you hear that I wrote like Jordan, that's really.
Jordan's the one who's heartbroken right now.
Jordan's like heartbroken and stuff, and he like, you can like tell him that you've heard it, like about it, but make sure you like initiate that it's a rumor and that you should talk to Leah about it, like make sure that it's a rumor. But, like,
Okay, so you tell him, but you also tell him this is a rumor and it's an unverified rumor, but you think you should know. Okay, that's one reason. Somebody else, why you should or maybe shouldn't tell Jordan. Go ahead.
I would strongly agree because I don't want to know, I feel like, and then make sure that he has all the available information that he could have.
Okay, so we like to think that if we're going to be good decision makers, that we're informed decision makers. It sounds like you're saying not only would I want to know if I'm in that situation, but it might be unethical for me not to give him all the information that I have. Okay? Okay, so you're saying disagree because the rumor is not yet confirmed. Okay? Deidre, go ahead.
I put strongly disagree. I was kind of on the fence between how strongly I disagree. On the one, partly it's because I'm really not into like spreading rumors, and that's kind of just its own thing. But more importantly, it's her information. She should be the one to tell people if that is the case.
Okay, so it's ultimately her body. It's her information. We don't know if it's true or if it's not true, but even if it is true, it's her information, is what you're saying. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
I said disagree just because, one, it's a rumor. Two, she said she still likes him and it's treatable. What's it matter in 6 months if they get together then?
Okay. So there's a lot of things at stake here. If there are STDs that are more treatable than other STDs, and if it's something that she has now that maybe she won't have in a couple of months, then maybe, yeah, okay.
I said that I would disagree because Jordan is already going through kind of like a tough time with the rejection, so I think like telling him this unconfirmed rumor would probably like cause him to maybe react extremely.
Telling him the rumor might cause him to act extremely?
Yeah.
Would it also be the case that not telling him the rumor would cause him to act extremely if he's really heartbroken? Could be either way. It's a good point though. Anybody else want to share? Yeah?
I said strongly agree because if he finds out and you knew, then he's probably not going to take that kindly.
Okay, so Jordan might be upset if he thinks you knew, and it comes out later that she actually does have an STD. Maybe he's even, a couple months from now, they get together, and then he contracts an STD, and you didn't tell him. Then you're kind of responsible for not telling him. Okay? Go ahead.
I feel like right now it's not really his business because it's not like they're together. Like it's different what you said, like if they were together, then tell him like if there's a rumor about this, like make sure you talk to her about it. But right now it's not really his business, she said.
So it's really her business to decide if she wants to date him or not.
Yeah.
It's her business to decide what she shares and what she doesn't. And ultimately, he can want all he wants, but it's up to her. It's her body and her decision to figure out what to do. Okay?
With that, I said agree because at least you could give him a heads up. That doesn't mean he has to do anything with the information, but that way it's just like, oh hey, like there's this rumor, just thought you should know, but you don't have to, like he doesn't have to confront the situation at all.
Okay, so the rumor exists. He can decide what he wants to do with that information, but ultimately you think the information should be shared in some capacity. Okay?
I said agree because, well, that's Jordan. Michael, was it?
The friend?
Michael? Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael and Jordan are good friends. And
Okay.
if Michael know about this rumor, Jordan's going to find out because people may or may not know that he already likes Leah. He could hear it from other people. And
Okay.
I think
So it's possible that if you don't share this rumor, you heard it from Michael, Michael's heard it from other people, someone might tell Jordan, even if that someone isn't you. Okay? Anybody else? Further thoughts? A lot of people in my last class were taking Leah's side and basically saying that if I'm Leah and that information is true, or if that information is not true, it's still pretty hurtful to have that information out there. And so maybe sharing that information isn't good for me. Right? A lot of people were taking Leah's side and saying it's ultimately up to her to decide whether she wants to be with Jordan or not, and you shouldn't really have that role in it. Some of my friends were defending Jordan and saying, you're a really good friend to Jordan. He's really hurting right now, and it might make him feel better if you tell him this rumor. Also telling him that it's a rumor and it's not a confirmed rumor. So let's just go back to our scenario for a second here. What are some things in here that you weren't sure about, that made it hard for you to decide if you wanted to tell Jordan or if you didn't want to tell Jordan? Yeah?
The validity of the rumor.
Okay, we don't know if this rumor is true or not. Michael has not asked Leah if she has an STD. Even if he asks her, she might lie to him. She might not want it known if she does have one, or she might get really upset, right? We don't know if this rumor is true or not. So it might help to know if this is actually a true rumor or not.
The fact that Michael's good friends with Leah and that he's never lied to her kind of hit me for a second.
Okay.
I'm confused, but that doesn't mean that it's automatically true, because maybe the person that Michael heard the rumor from doesn't like Leah, is just spreading the rumor.
Yeah, we don't know who told Michael. He says multiple people have told me, but we don't know how reliable those people are. Okay? What else makes it hard?
The quote that I was on the disagree side, but the quote that got me was, "I really like you, but I'm just not in the place to date anyone right now."
Right.
Because if that rumor was right, that would justify that statement. And it's not just an excuse.
Yeah, that statement itself is kind of messy, right? It's totally fine for people, men or women, to say, I'm just not interested right now. I just have some personal stuff going on right now. Maybe that's her way of saying, I don't want to hurt you, but I don't want to date you. And it's her nice way of saying it is, it's not you, it's me. Right? We don't know what she meant by that statement. Okay? What else is tricky here? Yeah.
The fact that Michael and Leah aren't really dating.
I'm sorry?
The fact that they're not dating, so it's kind of like irrelevant information.
Yeah, they're not dating. Jordan's still interested in Leah, and maybe in a few months, if he tries again, she will be interested in dating him, but right now they're not dating, so they're probably not sleeping together. So it doesn't really help Jordan right now. It might help him in the future if they end up sleeping together. Okay. What else is uncertain here? What else would you want more information about?
Not any real information about the relation or the parameters of the friendship between Michael and Jordan.
Yeah, it's not really clear if Michael and Jordan are friends or if Michael's telling you this information. He told you that information regardless of Jordan's involvement. But we don't know how close Michael and Jordan are. We don't know how close my relationship is with Jordan or Leah. There's a lot of relationship uncertainty here. There's also, yeah, go ahead.
I don't really know why Michael telling you this information.
Yeah, what are Michael's motives in telling you this information? Maybe Michael's interested in dating Leah and he just wants to eliminate competition, right? We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty here. And if you had a hard time making this decision, what you experienced was probably what communication scholars call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that uncomfortable feeling when we have to make a really difficult decision, and our brain experiences dissonance. It's split into at least two different directions, if not more. We have to make a really difficult decision, and we don't like making that decision. It's that discomfort of sitting with the decision and knowing that Jordan's on the other line, and no matter what I do, I'm going to have consequences for my relationship with Jordan, for my relationship with Leah, for Jordan's relationship with Leah, for Michael's relationship to me and everybody else involved. It's really complicated. So we just listed off a whole bunch of reasons why you might experience cognitive dissonance. Well, the main reason is that you're really good friends with Jordan, but you're also still pretty good friends with Leah, and you also care about Leah's well-being. And maybe you don't want to spread a rumor about her, but you also don't want Jordan to be in this place of pain, and you don't want him to get hurt if they do end up together later on. This is not an easy kind of ethical dilemma. These are the kinds of ethical dilemmas that we find ourselves in interpersonally all the time. When we're dealing with cognitive dissonance, most of the time we're dealing with triangles, and those triangles are unbalanced. We have to decide between the two things that we really like, or we have to decide between two things that we really don't like, but we still have to make a decision over which one's the lesser of two evils. That's when we experience this mental and emotional tension around trying to make an ethical decision. Now, if we're thinking about this from a communication standpoint, if we go back to our model here, we're trying to think through lots of different communication interactions. Michael told you something, somebody told Michael something, you're deciding if you want to tell Jordan something. If you decide to tell Jordan, he might react in particular ways and might tell other people, including possibly Leah. He might confront her, right? There's lots of different scenarios where we have to start this chain over and over again. In the communication model, we want a source to go really well, or a message to go really well from the source through a channel to a receiver. We want that message to be clear, we want it to be linear. And you've studied the communication model for a little over a week now, you've had an assignment around it. You've probably found that it's much better for diagnosing miscommunication than it is for diagnosing effective communication. One of the problems with the communication model is it's a very instrumental approach to communication. That is, you're using communication as a tool to send a message from one person to another. And we like to think that it's a linear process, and we like to think that we know who's responsible for different parts in that process, whether it goes right or whether it goes wrong. Communication ethics is really challenging when you're thinking about this model, because ultimately you have to ask yourself the question of, where does the meaning for this information reside? Where does it ultimately fall? Whose responsibility is it if, let's say, you tell Jordan, and Jordan for a minute feels better, but then he confronts Leah, and Leah doesn't have an STD, but she's upset, and then there's multiple chains in that interaction. Where does the blame fall? Does it fall upon Michael? Does it fall upon me? Does it fall upon Jordan? Does it fall upon Leah? Does it fall upon other people? When we're dealing with ethics, we usually are trying to deal with responsibility, and we're usually trying to place blame. And a lot of times when you have this communication model, if things don't go exactly according to plan, or if some ethical dilemma winds up as a huge problem for a whole bunch of people, rather than saying, oh, this is totally the receiver's fault, or this is totally the source's fault, or there is a problem in the channel, most of the time, the problem is involved in multiple places. There's multiple points in the communication that could have been done differently. So we can think through all the variables that made it hard for you to decide what you were going to do interpersonally just in this situation. Now we can talk about this not just interpersonally, but on a broader scale as well. I'll give you another example from my master's thesis. I wrote my master's thesis a few years ago on a trial that took place after the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, the president of Rwanda was shot down in a plane crash and died. Leading up to that plane crash, there had been kind of ongoing civil war, but kind of intermittent civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. And there was a newspaper called Kangura, which basically means wake up, and a radio station called the RTLN, it's a long name in French, so I won't further do it, that were basically spewing hate speech for months leading up to this genocide, saying if you are Hutu, the Tutsis are coming to destroy us. We have to wipe them out before they get to us first. They're cockroaches. They're not even human. They spewed all this hate speech, and they were basically the only ones in Rwanda that had radio. They didn't have, at this time, a lot of different competing news organizations. It was basically, this radio station was the radio station in Rwanda, and this was prior to television, right? What you ultimately ended up with in this case was, leading up to the genocide, this magazine or newspaper and this radio station spewing a whole bunch of hate speech. And within a few hours of the president's plane going down, people going over the radio and not just spewing hate speech about the Tutsi group in Rwanda, but also within a couple hours and certainly within a couple days and weeks, broadcasting over the radio, there's a group of Tutsis in this location. Go cut the tall trees. And you all can guess what go cut the tall trees meant. Rwanda had imported a machete for almost every single adult male. in the country. About 800,000 people were killed over the course of 100 days. And the genocide happened, and the genocide wrapped up. And a lot of it was very brutal, with people with machetes. And the courts decided we have to do something about this. There was an international criminal tribunal that took place through the UN. The tribunal had to decide for these three media executives, the two who ran the radio station and the one who ran the newspaper, are they guilty in some capacity for the genocide? What they had to decide was a legal concept called incitement. Now, if you're not familiar with the term incitement, incitement basically means that my words lead to your actions. It basically means that if I'm the source and you're the receiver of a message, that I transmit my message and you have no control over what to do with that message. My message is so powerful that it can get you to do anything, including killing your neighbors with machetes. The courts had to decide, were these three media executives responsible in some capacity for the genocide? They tried them for incitement to genocide. It was the second time in human history that someone was tried for incitement to genocide. The first time was after the Holocaust. So there wasn't a whole lot of precedent to say these people are guilty or these people are not guilty. Now, the courts ultimately decided these three media executives were guilty and sent to long prison terms that essentially amounted to life in prison. But that doesn't necessarily get us away from the ethical questions that we're facing here. They were the source of the message, not just that these other people, these Tutsis, are inferior and rising up against us and whatever other hate speech they were saying. But literally they were telling people, go to this place at this particular time and they'll be there, and if you come ready, you can kill them. We have to ask ourselves, what about the people on the receiving end of that message? If you're listening to the radio and somebody is telling you to go kill your neighbor, do you ethically say, I have no control, the radio is so powerful that I have to go kill my neighbor? Or do you say, I can't. I draw the line there. I listened to this radio station, I picked up on some of what they were saying, and this was the last straw for me. I can't do it. The communication model isn't particularly good at helping us through ethical problems. What it's good for is finger pointing. What it's good for is what we like to refer to as the hypodermic needle model of communication, or the magic bullet theory of communication. What that means is basically, if the source sends a message to the receiver and the receiver gets that message is so powerful that the receiver has no choice over what they do with their actions. This isn't particularly a good model for helping us think through ethical dilemmas. We still have cognitive dissonance that we have to wrestle with this model. Now, I told you in the first week of this class that an instructor or a course director of mine told me, don't talk to your students about communication apprehension. You're not really supposed to tell them about communication apprehension. The more you talk about it, the more anxiety they're going to feel. You shouldn't talk about it. And I said, I have a secret. I'm going to talk to you about it anyway, but I'm not supposed to. I'm talking to you about ethics today, and I have another secret for you, and that is that I hate teaching communication ethics. I'm doing it because I feel a responsibility to teach you communication ethics. But the reason that I hate communication ethics is that you can't really do justice to it. You all were supposed to have read the ethics chapter out of your textbook. Communication ethics gets one chapter out of your textbook. That chapter, I think I counted, is about 12 pages. 12 pages is not going to tell you what you need to know about communication ethics. I can't, in 50 minutes, tell you everything that you need to know about communication ethics. I'm going to do my best to help you think through some ways of approaching it, but I don't have easy answers for you. I don't have the right answers. I don't have the right way of thinking about it. Now, one way to approach communication ethics is to go back a couple hundred years to Cato the Elder. Cato the Elder was a Roman statesman. Cato the Elder gave us a formula for what he thought the ideal orator was, the ideal public speaker. The ideal public speaker for Cato the Elder was a vir bonus discendi peritus. I might be butchering the Latin. It's not one of the languages I speak. What it roughly translates to is a good person speaking well. In Cato the Elder's time, it would have meant a good man speaking well. Now we have to think about what that means for us. If that is the model of the ideal public speaker, why is it the case that many public speakers don't fit that mold? How do we as public speakers approach that mold? Is that even the ideal that we should be striving toward? Now we can take Cato the Elder's idea and map it out and figure out what he's trying to say. You can think through, if this is what we're striving toward, a good person speaking well, then we can take both parts of that. We can think about a bad person speaking poorly. This is someone who doesn't have good ethics and either doesn't speak well in public or doesn't speak in public at all because they decide not to. They're a bad person. Their ethics are kind of off. They don't have a whole lot of influence. We can also probably point to some examples, either from history or from today, of a bad person who's able to speak well. This is someone that a lot of people would agree is dangerous. A lot of people would agree that their speech is troublesome, and yet they're able to get an audience. They're able to be out there, they're able to talk and persuade and to get people on board with their bad ethics. We'd also have a good example of a good person speaking poorly. This is someone whose ethics we like, but either they don't speak well and they're not eloquent, or they decide not to speak in public and they're good people, but they're bystanders. Or they're non-influential. People just dismiss them and write them off and say, you know, yeah, we care about your ethics, but we're not going to listen to you because you're not very good at speaking, or you don't speak all that often, or you don't speak all that well. If we're striving toward this good person speaking well, we have to recognize that these other three categories exist, and we can probably think of several examples of people who fit into each category. But ultimately what we're dealing with is ethics and influence. How good are a person's ethics, and how much influence do they have over other people? Now, who gets to determine who the beer bonus or weir bonus is? Who is this good person who is supposed to be speaking well? My sense is that if I were to ask you what constitutes a good person, there's probably about 300 of you in the room right now. You could give me some different definitions of what a good person is. I don't know that we would entirely agree upon the definition of a good person. But this is nevertheless the ideal that you should be striving toward, or at least that's what the tradition says. So when we're dealing with language, when we're dealing with trying to figure out how to speak, when we're dealing with the communication model in that hypodermic needle sense, or in that magic bullet sense, or when we're not dealing with it in that sense, we're trying to make language as good as it can possibly be. Human beings want language to be a lot of things. They want that language to be clear. It basically means that I can express what it is that I'm trying to talk about, and you can understand what it is that I'm trying to say if you're the receiver. We want our language to be stable. That is, we want our language to have only one meaning, and we want that meaning to be pretty universally agreed upon. That it's clear, but it's also fixed. And I'll give you an example. When I taught the communication model in my lab section, we played the game Telephone that a lot of you probably played in elementary school. And the message that I gave to my class was a fortune cookie that one of my friends as a graduate student received when we went out for Chinese dinner. It said, "Relationships is like fingers of your hand. One cannot do much." I have no idea what that fortune cookie was trying to say. I could probably guess, and there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty with it. But if we're playing that telephone game and trying to pass that message around the room, the goal of our transmission is for that message to be the same message at the end of the line as it was at the beginning of the line, even if that message made no sense to begin with. So that message itself wasn't clear. That message also wasn't stable. We want our language to be referential. We want it to refer to the thing that we're trying to express. We talked about the process of encoding, that is, taking an abstract idea and translating it into words or symbols or something that someone else can understand, and then the process of decoding that the receiver goes through, of taking that message, whether it's symbolic or textual, and trying to get at that abstract idea again, so that we're passing abstract ideas across one another. If I'm referring to that table, you all can probably agree with me in talking about that particular object right there. If I'm talking about justice, we might have different interpretations of what justice means. And the justice that I'm referring to might be different from the justice that you're referring to. Nevertheless, we want our language to mirror, we want justice to be as clear as table. We want our language to be unambiguous. That is, we want it to be impossible for the receiver to understand anything other than what the source intended. We don't want any room for multiple meanings. We don't want any room for uncertainty or miscommunication. We want that language to be perfect. And we want it to be agreed upon. That ultimately, at the end of the day, source, message, channel, receiver, the source and the receiver end up with the same message. They both agree upon what that message is literally saying, and they're agreeing upon what that message means and how to interpret or understand it if it's not entirely clear. We want our language to be perfect when we communicate. We very rarely actually get that in practice. It's similar when we try to relate that to ethics. We want our ethics to be perfect in a lot of the same ways. We want our ethics to be rational. That is, we want to have some kind of system in place where we can reason logically how to arrive at the right conclusion. We want to have a system in place to understand how we're going to decide if we tell Jordan that rumor or if we don't tell Jordan that rumor. And we want it to be something that is a system that other people can use as well. We want our ethics to be simple. We don't like that feeling of cognitive dissonance of trying to have to decide between two things. We want our ethics to be simple and straightforward. If any of you have seen the Simpsons movie, there's a character in there who becomes president, and he says, "I was elected to lead, not to read." And they put 5 options in front of him, and he picks number 4, and they ask him why he picked number 4, and he just says, "Number 4, that's what I picked, that's what we're going with," right? We want our ethics to be that simple, where it doesn't really matter what the consequences are, we just make the decision and we stick with it. We want our ethics to be grounded in something. We want to have principles of some kind to point to and say, this is why I made that decision. It goes with it being rational. What is that rationality? If any of you have actually studied ethics, you probably know some different ethical systems like utilitarianism and deontology. I'm not going to bore you with a big description of what that means, but what I do want you to recognize is that there are different systems for making decisions, and they're ethical in different ways, and a lot of the time, the systems clash with one another, and we have to make sense of them. We have to make sense of the differences in those systems when one tells us the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and the other one tells us this thing is always right and that thing is always wrong. We want our logic to be clear, and we want to be able to point to something to say why we arrived at the conclusion we arrived at. We want our ethics to be fair. We don't like zero-sum games, a lot of them. We don't like games where one person wins at another person's expense. We don't like win-lose kinds of scenarios where Jordan might feel better if I tell him this rumor, but Leah would be devastated to learn that people are spreading rumors about her when they're not true. We want our ethics to be fair. We want them to be universal across different people. Unfortunately, in the world we live in, a lot of politics, a lot of ethical dilemmas, a lot of decisions we have to make do fall into more or less some kind of zero-sum game, or at least some people benefit and other people lose out. Last but not least, we want our ethics to be decisive. When we make a decision, we say number 4, we want people to follow option number 4. So I'll tell you, I've been teaching a graduate seminar recently on intercultural global conflict. And a concept that's come up a lot in that graduate seminar is impunity. I'm not going to ask you if you know what that word means. I'm going to tell you that that word means that we basically agree that what you did was unethical, but there's no system in place to charge you or to punish you for it. Or if there is a system in place to punish you for it, the punishment doesn't fit the crime, and you get off easy. Or we decide not to press charges. Impunity basically means that someone gets away with doing something that a lot of other people decide is unethical. What all of this is getting at is what Kenneth Burke, who was a 20th century rhetorician, called his definition of man. He was trying to differentiate human beings from other animals. One of the things that he said is a really unique feature about human beings is that they're rotten with perfection. We want not only our language to be perfect, we want our ethics to be perfect. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, we don't get either one. You've seen miscommunications happen. You've even tried to stop them from happening, and they still happen anyways. You've seen people get away with things that they probably shouldn't have gotten away with. We want to use language to try and get at good ethics, and both language and ethics are flawed in ways that are not perfect. And I'm sure this isn't news to you, but I want you to think about what it means for you in the context of your interpersonal everyday interactions. And this isn't for me to just lecture to or at you, but it's really more for you to just be thinking, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And how do I arrive at the decisions that I get to? And to recognize that most of the time, it's not a perfect process. In fact, it's very far from it a lot of the time. When we're dealing with ethical dilemmas, a lot of the time what we're dealing with are competing systems of values. Values are anything that we consider important. Values are the things that we're willing to fight for. In some cases, the things that we're willing to die for. I want you to take 30 seconds to a minute with the list that's up on the board. And this is not a comprehensive list of things that you could find important. I want you to take 30 seconds to a minute and think through, if I had to choose my top 1, 2, or 3 values off of this list, and if I had to choose it over the other ones, what would be my top 3 values that I would choose? So take a second and think through that. Feel like you have them? If you're comfortable, share with a neighbor which 3 values you picked and why. Top 3 values. Why did you pick them? Once you have them, share with a neighbor.
I got 2.
It sounds like most of you have been able to share. And if you haven't, you can still think about this question. It's not something that you have to leave the room with today and be settled on forever. I'm showing you this because this is most of the time why teaching ethics is such a mess. Why I hate teaching communication ethics. So one of the reasons is when we have to pin all of these things, which we all probably value to some extent, we have to pick our top 3, it's really hard to do. I'm curious, if you were talking to a neighbor, how many of you shared your top 3 values and the other person had the same top 3 values? None of you. How many of you had the same, maybe, okay. How many of you had the same top value? A couple of you, right? We all have different reasons for valuing different things over other things. And you're all at a place in your lives where you're figuring out what your values are. And you're going to probably be reevaluating what your values are from time to time. Now, some of you are going to pick those top 3 values, and those will be the top 3 values if I ask you a week from now, if I ask you a year from now, if I ask you 50 years from now, you'll still have the same top 3 values. Others of you, I could ask you in 10 minutes what your top 3 values are, and if you thought about it some more, you said, I thought this, and I sat with the list some more, and now I'm thinking that. And maybe 2 years from now or 5 years from now, you're totally different. I'm not here to tell you what your values are or should be. You'll notice I didn't make a turning point question out of this. I'm not going to go question by question and say, who had this as their top value? I'm not interested in what your actual values are. What I'm interested in is the process by which you arrived at those values. What I'm interested in is when you have to make decisions and you have to pair 2 of these against one another, in the same way that we had a cognitive dissonance triangle with Jordan and Leah, sometimes you have to make cognitive dissonance triangles with ethical decisions and which values are okay here. If I'm starving and I want to eat, but I have no money, and I have to go steal a loaf of bread, I'm probably putting my health against my legal standing, right? It's usually illegal for you to steal a loaf of bread. You have to sometimes ask yourself if it's ethical to approach a partner and say, I'm interested in love, when really all you're interested in is sex. And you have to pair love and sex with one another and figure out which one of those is most important. You can pair any one of these values together. Ultimately, when you have two values that are competing with one another, you're going to feel that cognitive dissonance on a whole new level. When you feel like your personal beliefs are involved and you have cognitive dissonance, not just about the people in your life, but about who you are as a person and what kinds of things are important to you, it's really not easy to do that. But I'm curious, how many of you found it pretty easy to come up with your list of your top 3 values? 2, 3, 4, maybe 7 or 8 of you. How many of you found it pretty difficult? About the same number. How many of you were kind of neutral on it? A couple of you. Most of the time when I ask undergrads about the process of choosing which values are important to them, they tell me it's really hard. They say, it's not always easy. And I was just saying that we want both our language and our ethics to be universal in some capacity, where the same values win out every time. Most of the time when we find ourselves in ethical dilemmas, it's bound to a very particular context. And usually that context is one that we didn't expect to find ourselves in. And so we, on the spot, have to decide if our religion is more important than something else, maybe possessions, right? We have to decide if our commitment to equality is more important to us than money. It's complicated, and there usually isn't one right answer. There isn't usually a coherent, consistent process. When we're dealing with ethics, we have multiple ways of arriving at the conclusions that we arrive at, and those conclusions also have consequences, whether positive or negative. So it's really hard to teach communication ethics, because we don't like saying, I value this more than that. We like to think that we value everything. We like to think that we can just decide, and everything will be fine. It's really hard to teach communication ethics in 50 minutes, but most of the time what it comes down to is a clash of values. And for a lot of people, clashing values are really hard to resolve, and they're really hard to resolve through logic, through rationality, through language. Most of the time when we're dealing with values, we're dealing with emotion, at least in some capacity. There might be a logic to it, but a lot of times it's kind of our gut feeling of which one should win out at the end of the day. Now, if it's hard to come up with which things you should value in a particular context, that's probably because ethics is one of the most abstract and one of the hardest ways of trying to arrive at conclusions, normative conclusions about what we should do. When we're talking about the normative realm, it has to do not with the world that is, but the world that should be. Ethics is really complicated because most of the time it depends on your personal conscience. It relies on your thoughts and your emotions in your own head, or it relies on some kind of ethical system and trying to reason inductively or deductively what the right answer is, who should be praised, who should be blamed, what is right, what is wrong. There are a couple other systems that Foyman and Fraser have in their textbook on ethics that distinguish these different systems, ethics, from other systems that are related. So religion has some of the same ends for a lot of people as ethics. Religion is also, like ethics, trying to get at this question of right and wrong. But when religion tries to do it, it's mostly trying to do it from a place of religious authority. So that religious authority could be a text that you deem a sacred text. And you say, I read this text, I know what this text means, I can understand it. It clearly tells me I shall not do X and I must do Y, and therefore I shall not do X and I must do Y. It could be a religious authority in a text. It could also be a religious authority in a person. Maybe there's a spiritual leader that you look up to, and in moments of crisis, you turn to your spiritual leader and say, what does the religion tell me to do in this situation? For those of you who aren't religious, you could look at the bottom two systems, and we can probably think of a few others. We have legal authority that also tries to get at questions of right and wrong, but it tries to codify them. Instead of saying this is ethically acceptable and this is ethically unacceptable, the law determines what is legal and what is illegal, and it determines consequences based on what the law says. Most of the time, if we're dealing with a legal system, we're dealing with people who had an ethical dilemma and they tried to resolve it. Two people had a disagreement over something and they had to figure out how to resolve the disagreement. There were crimes that were happening and people were upset about those crimes, and so they had to figure out what things should be illegal and what things shouldn't be illegal and with what consequences. Etiquette's one that we don't often think of as an ethical system, but it also shares some things with ethics. Rather than trying to get at what's right and wrong, ethics is all about trying to figure out what's proper and what's not proper. You can probably hear it in my voice, and I'll just tell you that I spent most of the weekend struggling with a bad head cold. And I sense I heard a lot of coughing and sneezing in here earlier. And some of you have been struggling with this as well. If I were to cough or sneeze right now and I didn't cover my cough or sneeze, some of you would probably think I'm disgusting. Some of you might think that's unethical because I'm also transmitting germs to up to 300 people who can also go around a small campus and transmit germs to other people. Culture helps us determine what is improper or what is proper. And most of the time, it's what do people think of us? Do they like us or do they not like us? If you're using culture as your system of ethics, you have to deal with the consequences of that. None of these systems is perfect. Some of them are more codified into strict rules that must or can't be obeyed or shouldn't be obeyed. They have different stakes for them in terms of whether you're going to go to jail or whether your friends are going to stop hanging out with you. Excuse me. They're all different systems that share something in common with ethics. And when you can't necessarily get at that personal conscience, you might have other ethical systems telling you what to do. But ultimately, the best message I have for you about communication ethics is that you can't really boil it down to a clear system. What's ethical often depends on choices that we make, which systems we decide to use for making our decisions. What do we do when those systems come in conflict with other systems? And I'm telling you this somewhat in the abstract sense of I want you to be good people speaking well. I want you to cultivate that good person ethos, whatever that happens to be. But I also want you to be able to speak well. And so I want you to be thinking about your interactions, whether interpersonal or on kind of a mass scale if you're speaking to a large audience, in ethical terms. Just like we do audience analysis, we kind of have to do self-analysis as well and figure out what does it mean for me to be an ethical person? What does that mean, and how might I deal with people who think of ethics in a slightly different way than what I do? The last message I have for you comes from my graduate director at Texas A&M, and I was studying in graduate school, and I was learning how to teach. Kevin Barge, who was our graduate director at the time, said, we have this idea of free speech in our country. We are kind of the champions of free speech around the world. Other countries look to us, they want us to show them what it means to have free speech, to allow even the worst people in our system to be able to speak. We had a conversation in here a couple weeks ago about political correctness, and whether you like political correctness or dislike political correctness, the conclusion for a lot of you is that as speakers, we might have to, or we probably should, engage in some version of that, whether it comes to what Stephen Lucas called personal courtesy. Kevin Barge, who was my grad director at the time, said, we have this idea of free speech, and that's a legal thing enshrined in the First Amendment. But a lot of us also have this ethical contract that's more socially created of this notion of responsible speech. That it's not just, I can speak freely and say whatever I want. We've had Supreme Court cases about this, where you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater, or if the thing that you say is deemed to be clear and present danger, or deemed to be incitement. There are rare cases when you can legally be punished for trying to exercise your First Amendment rights. They're rare in this country, but they do happen. But outside of the legal realm or the political realm where the First Amendment guarantees us free speech, we also have to think to ourselves, what does it mean to be responsible as speakers? How do we use that free speech in a way that is productive and helpful and responsible and kind? So that's what I want you to be thinking about is where do you find the balance between free speech and responsible speech? And I want you to be thinking about what each means in your classroom when you're thinking about your speech topics or actually delivering your speeches. I want you to be thinking about it in the workplace when you actually have jobs and you have coworkers and you disagree with your coworkers. What does it mean to have free and responsible speech in the workplace, and what are the consequences of the choices you make? When you're talking with your friends and your family, it's probably different from that balance that you would strike with acquaintances. Probably most importantly here is how would you handle that balance between free and responsible speech with people that you disagree with? So I want to leave you today thinking through your ethics personally, professionally, politically, whatever it may be. Every time that you engage in speech, recognize that ethics are complicated and that there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything goes. So I'll leave you there, and we'll come back next week